The idea for this video came from experiences that I've had in Protestant churches before I became Catholic, as well as interactions I've had with Protestants online on my YouTube channel, in which I encounter a lot of the same remarks and arguments from Protestants about Catholics over and over again. And instead of responding to each one over and over again, I thought it would be better to try to catalog them and to come up with a response in a video that I could then direct them towards. So that gave me the idea to do a video called Stupid Things That Protestants Say About Catholics. And in my eagerness to make that video, I had a moment of grace in which I said, well, you know, to be fair, I should put the shoe on the other foot and spend some time reflecting on what it is that we Catholics say towards Protestants in that same way. So I still plan on making that other video. It will probably come out next week. But in the spirit of justice, and even if I can flatter myself a little bit, charity, I decided to do this video first. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that there's a lot of potential for me to pay a price from among certain demographics who follow me, who are very online Catholic Crusader demographics, who are very reluctant to concede any ground to those that they disagree with, which makes it tempting to add like 6 minutes of disclaimers and explanations to this video that would make it boring and very long. So instead of doing that, can I invite all of us to examine ourselves, admit our own frailty, and our penchant for making mistakes? This isn't a concession that Protestantism is true or Catholicism wrong, or that the two are equal in some way, but instead it's an admission that even though a person can adhere to the truth or intend to adhere to what is true, we can still sin against that truth in the way that we interact with others who don't have the same beliefs with us, or the way that we can communicate that truth because of our own misunderstandings, again, our frailties, and perhaps our insecurities. So with all of that said, here are stupid things that Catholics say about Protestants. The first is a comment that appears on my channel quite often, because whenever I'm trying to describe church-going people in general, whether they be Protestant or Catholic or otherwise, I'll often say the phrase Catholics and Christians as a kind of a catch-all. And the reply I often get from Catholics is, you shouldn't say that because Protestants aren't Christians. Or worse, they'll say that the phrase Catholic Christians is a redundancy and unnecessary. It seems that more than a few Catholics think that the word Catholic is a synonym for Christian. In other words, they don't know what the word Catholic means. Catholic isn't another word for Christian. In fact, it means according to the whole. It's a way of describing the faith and our understanding of the faith and the deposit of that knowledge. When we say Catholic Christianity, we're saying the whole complete deposit of the faith, because heresy is an attempt to try to narrow the scope to one or some small range of statements about the faith, and then to ignore the rest, especially with those things that compete with that potential understanding. Truth cannot be confined to our narrow-minded preferences simply because they're easier to understand that way and easier to adopt. So we as Catholics insist that followers of Jesus profess faith in all the teachings of Christ and his church. That's what Catholic means. But what about this claim that Protestants aren't Christian, or that to use the word Christian when referring to Protestants is inaccurate or inappropriate? Well, I would say that this is a hard claim to make in any sort of definitive way. And to whatever degree that the magisterium addresses this issue, it seems to disagree. Throughout, for example, Unitatis Redintegratio, which is a document of the Second Vatican Council, it refers to divided Christians and Christian communions. In other words, it describes non-Catholics as Christians. It goes on to say, and this is quoted in the Catechism of the Catholic Church in paragraph 1271, the differences that exist in varying degrees between baptized non-Catholics and the Catholic Church, whether in doctrine and sometimes in discipline, or concerning the structure of the Church, do indeed create many obstacles, sometimes serious ones, to full ecclesiastical communion. But even in spite of them, it remains true that all who have been justified by faith in baptism are members of Christ's body and have a right to be called Christian. And this same passage cites the Council of Florence, which seems to admit that there are groups of people who are not in full communion with Rome, but yet still identify as Christian, as if this is more a matter of how a person identifies based on one's sincere intent to follow Christ and his church than it is a question of how successful they are in doing so. It also says that all who are baptized become members of Christ's body and his church. Now, obviously, more is needed to grow in justification and sanctity, but that should be considered enough to identify as a Christian. Baptism is the fundamental criterion that delineates a person as a Christian. The second stupid thing that Catholics say about Protestants is that they are heretics. And I know this one's going to be controversial, so let's all just take a deep breath, say a little prayer, and allow me some grace and some patience while I try to explain. The church is actually quite clear about what heresy is and what it means to be a heretic. In order to be a heretic, you have to, first of all, obstinately and publicly deny a truth that the church has defined as revealed by God. The second thing is that you have to be morally culpable for that denial, which means that you have to understand that it's a denial of the teaching of the church and then commit yourself to persist in that denial. Now, in my experience, there are a lot of Catholics who are what we might call material heretics, which means that they deny certain revealed truths of the Catholic faith. And this is true even of sincere Catholics who are committed to adhering to the Orthodox faith, but for one reason or another are mistaken about something or don't know about something that the church teaches that might actually surprise them. Now, we don't go around accusing them of being heretics or calling them heretics because they aren't publicly or obstinately denying some truth of the faith. They might just be mistaken or ignorant of that fact. And this is easy to do in the age of information because we all have easy access, and by easy, I would also say superficial access, to details that should require careful study, which is discouraged by the medium of online communication. That's why you can earn a PhD in theology. It's because it's complicated. It's a science unto itself. To assume that any of us internet sleuths have a comprehensive enough grasp of the theology that's out there because of some extract that we read on the internet out of context, and then to use that to accuse others who have an equally superficial comprehension or grasp of the concepts is to trivialize the splendor of the discipline of theology. And there are plenty of us who are material heretics for that reason and don't realize it. But as far as Protestants go, there are people who are separated from the Catholic Church and technically Protestant because the communities that they belong to and the doctrines that they accept are descended from some branch of Protestantism, but they don't know it or understand it in those terms, in the same way that there are plenty of Catholics who don't understand that they are material heretics because they don't understand that context. Protestantism has fractured so many times that people in the 21st century who belong to vaguely defined non-denominational churches are so far removed from the Protestant Revolution that they don't think of themselves as being associated with it. And because they aren't adequately formed in the history of it all, they are unaware of how their community or the theological influences that inform their understanding of the faith can be traced back to the Protestant rupture. So there's a considerable amount of remoteness from the necessary understanding that would make them morally culpable enough to be considered formal heretics. Yes, you might be able to say that Protestants are material heretics in the way that you could accuse many Catholics of being material heretics because of their flawed understanding, but they are not formal heretics, which is what we should reserve the word heretic for if we're going to use it as a moral accusation. Now, that's not to say that there aren't Protestants who fully understand the theological and historical context and willingly line themselves up with Luther and Calvin and the rest, and are therefore morally culpable. But in my experience of interacting with Protestants and even celebrating in Protestant communities, it seems like most are not familiar with those details and don't really identify with Protestantism in that way. I'll leave this point with a quote from Pope Benedict, who explains this far better than I could or have so far. So he says this: "There is no appropriate category in Catholic thought for the phenomenon of Protestantism today. It is obvious that the old category of heresy is no longer of value. Heresy for Scripture and the early church includes the idea of a personal decision against the unity of the church. And heresy's characteristic is the obstinacy of him who persists in his own private way. This, however, cannot be regarded as an appropriate description of the spiritual situation of the Protestant Christian. Perhaps we may here invert a saying of St. Augustine's, that an old schism becomes a heresy. The very passage of time alters the character of a division, so that an old division is something essentially different from a new one. The conclusion is inescapable then. Protestantism today is something different from heresy in the traditional sense. And that's important if you want to use the word heresy in the traditional sense. If you want to hold to the traditional theological understanding of heresy, then you have to stick to the traditional definition. And if you do, you will find that those who are descended from Protestantism or those who are affiliated with non-Catholic communities of worship do not meet those criteria. And yes, I know there are quotes from Pope Pius XII and Pope Leo XIII and others that can be quoted in apparent contrast to what I've said here. But all of those, in the context that I've read them in, seem to be describing those who separate themselves from the church as a deliberate act, which cannot be said for most Protestants today. Further statements in encyclicals do not carry more magisterial weight than doctrines that are taught in ecumenical councils. So if we think there's an apparent contradiction here that needs to be resolved, we should be looking for clarity on this topic from the Second Vatican Council, because again, that's an ecumenical council and it carries more weight than apparent statements in encyclicals. Okay, so finally, the last stupid things that Catholics say about Protestants is that they are ignorant of history. And this is probably largely informed by a famous quote by St. John Henry Newman, who was himself Protestant and then became Catholic, who said, "To be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant." I would add a qualification to that, which is to be accurately deep in history is to then jeopardize your Protestantism, because there are different currents, different flavors, and streams of interpretations of history. And don't get me wrong here, I'm not saying that they're all equally valid, because they're not. There's one true history, but there are multiple persuasive accounts of that true history. And the reason I'm so convinced of this point is because when I think of my own formation in the history of the West, especially of the ancient world, and then Christendom, which descended from it, that formation came from an extensive series of lectures that were from a Protestant academic, and they were amazing. My own understanding grew in leaps and bounds after listening to those lectures. Now, he got some portions of that history wrong, especially at key intervals where you could take a more sympathetic view or a more hostile view of the Catholic role or the Catholic Church's role in that history. But he did have explanations for his Protestant inclinations that, though I would consider wrong, weren't unreasonable. Because the thing about the church is that it has changed over time. Now, I don't mean change in the sense of being one thing at a certain point in time and then changing into another that is contrary to what it was before, but rather change in the sense of development. In the same way that I have changed considerably from the time I was a 7-month-old infant. I weighed a fraction of what I do now. My beard was a lot thinner back then. I had a far more limited vocabulary than I do now. And if you were to do a side-by-side comparison, you'd be excused for recognizing more differences than similarities. And yet we probably all agree that both are validly defined as Brian Holdsworth because of some essential, substantial quality that remain consistent throughout all of that change and fluctuation. This is actually one of the most difficult rational questions to resolve, how a thing can change and even change a lot and still be what it is. In the case of the church, it has developed over 2,000 years so that even an astute observer might mistake those changes for being significant enough that it is no longer the same thing. Well, there are Protestants who look at the way that the early church was, and then they look at the way that it developed into the Middle Ages, and then the way that the Catholic Church is today, and they look at all of that and say that those changes are significant enough that they are fatal to the Catholic claim of being that same apostolic church. To which we as Catholics would say, yes, it has changed, but those changes aren't fatal to the claims of the Catholic Church. The substantial essence of the church has remained consistent throughout. It's just much more elaborate and developed as the passage of time has given it occasion to to expand its definitions and its understanding of the faith. In the same way that I've changed dramatically since the time I was a 6-month-old, and yet I'm still me. Now, it takes a heavyweight like St. John Henry Newman to explain how that is the case, which isn't something that I'm equal to, at least not in the context of this video. But my point here is that there are Protestants, and a lot of Protestants, who are very fluent in history, and in fact more fluent than a lot of the Catholics that I know. So that's my list for now. There are probably more that I could identify, but I think that that's enough for the length of this video. And I also hope that it is enough of a self-deprecating exercise that I will be excused for flipping the script next week and to tell you about the stupid things that Protestants say about Catholics.
Hey, thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you are able to support the work I'm doing, there are a couple of ways you can do that: by donating through my website or by joining my online community, The Reinforcements. Both can be done by visiting brianholdsworth.ca, the .ca because that's how we internet in Canada. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. And again, thanks for watching.